Would you say that this Ouroboros protocol is the most significant outcome from the research based on Cardano protocol?
Is it the most significant research that came out of the Cardano research? Probably yes, I would say. There has been other significant stuff, but they more or less all relate to Ouroboros to some extent. So I would say that's definitely like the backbone of many other stuff.
Is there an actual benefit for using Ouroboros and what you're looking to do with Mina and the ZK aspects?
Yeah, the Ouroboros Genesis chain selection rule basically adapted in Ouroboros Samasika to allows you to have like a compact summary of the chain where you say, okay, I have this proof that it's valid, and I have a proof that the minimum window density is that number. And then in order to pick any chain from a given set of candidates, you only have to compare that one thing. So Ouroboros was a good target for creating a succinct blockchain.
Hello everyone, welcome to Just the Metrics podcast. Today we are having a conversation with Dr. Philipp Kant and Mathias Benkort about Ouroboros protocol. Dr. Philipp Kant is the technical product manager at Mina Foundation, and Mathias Benkort is the technical director of open source development at Cardano Foundation. And today we also have one more host, Perry Wasserbauer. He's a tech enthusiast. So without further ado, let's start the conversation about Ouroboros. And before we go really into the topic, could you give a brief introduction on your background, Dr. Philipp, and then Mathias?
Sure, yeah, I'm Philipp. I started my career as a particle physicist. So I did some theoretical particle physics. That's also where I got my PhD. And then after doing that for a couple of years, I decided to make a switch to software engineering. And the first contact I got with Ouroboros was when I joined IOHK back then in 2017, implementing Cardano. And more recently made the switch, not that recently, actually, 2 years ago, to Mina Foundation, working on Mina, where also Ouroboros is used. So that's why I'm here. And thanks for inviting me.
So my name is Mathias. I'm a software engineer. I've been doing that for as long as I remember, actually. Started pretty early on. I'm a big open source advocate and functional programming fan. I've been working on the Cardano ecosystem for the past 7 years. First as an engineer at Input Output, and more recently at the Cardano Foundation. And I think I've been working pretty much across the entire board, from the node itself to wallets to research projects like Hydra, nowadays on compilers like Aiken, and I'm back to Node and building tools for the ecosystem.
Cool. How was your exposure to Ouroboros protocol from that perspective? What's your take on that? So
at least for me, first it was as a user mainly, because I've been building tools on top of the Cardano node. So you got to have a fair amount of understanding of what's going on to use it. And more recently, I've started diving a lot more in depth because I'm looking into re-implementing some of that, which requires understanding all the nifty details about it, and also understanding how other implementation exists. Because there is one paper that kind of gives you a high level guidelines in a way, but then there are many things that comes on top of that in terms of networking, ledger, and so on. And so Cardano is one instantiation of that, but there are others like Mina or Polkadot or who knows who is using also Ouroboros.
For me, it was back in the day, like before the mainnet launch of Cardano. I joined the development team and read the paper, understood it, and then basically have been in contact with it ever since. Back at Cardano, I led the formal methods team, which was looking at making sure that all the proofs that you have in the paper, that they carry over to the implementation. So that involved a lot of reading, also many conversations with the scientists, looking at the parameters which are safe, and all of these things.
Yeah, and I would even add, I think I'm just specifically talking about Ouroboros Praos here. Right, because Ouroboros is now a whole family of protocols, and there are some of them I haven't read even in full. Like Crypsinus, I think I haven't even looked at the paper yet. And Genesis, I've kind of went through the main part of the paper, but I think only Praos really at the moment is kind of in use. and the other one are more like at a stage of being implemented here and there. And the classic is kind of the old one that's, well, it's good as a foundation, but I think Praos is still the main protocol we look at right now.
Yeah, on the Mina side, we use Ouroboros Masika, which is basically an extension of Genesis that allows you to have a succinct blockchain where you don't need to have the whole chain in order to you don't need to have the whole chain history in order to pick a chain, which is a nice feat.
For the long fork,
Yeah.
Before we go into the details of the versions and more to the technical side, if you just take a step back and look at the core value proposition of why, or the main problem Ouroboros protocol was trying to solve.
Okay. I mean, the main thing is that you want to have a provably secure proof of stake algorithm, because proof of work isn't really sustainable. And so having a proof of stake system with the same security guarantees that Bitcoin has, that was like the motivation behind doing that.
Yeah, and I've always seen it to be in that way. Like the way Ouroboros started was first by doing an analysis of Bitcoin and what makes Bitcoin great in terms of what properties does it have. Okay, it's a fully permissionless ledger on an open network, and how can you now capture what are the nice properties of that system and try to get the same nice properties, but with a fraction of the resources that it demands, and maintain the same security guarantees. And you could say arguably the first version of Ouroboros was almost there, but not quite there, because Ouroboros Classic still required having a set of parties that were more or less known and not having dynamic availability and so on. And Genesis, or I think Masika in that sense too, is finally achieves that. It has all the nice things that Bitcoin has in terms of properties and availability, but also has now you would say, more sustainable kind of structure and also more performant protocol overall.
Maybe, Perry, you can jump in to the conversation.
Some people who may not understand the difference of BFT style versus longest chain, right? What properties do we get from longest chain protocol that might be better than a BFT? That main reason someone might choose Bitcoin, a Bitcoin style architecture.
So the main thing you get, it's also a trade-off, right? Yeah, you get stuff, but you also lose stuff. The main thing you get is, I'm going to say decentralization, but it's a bit like a buzzword in a sense, but you get a network that scales more efficiently because you have less network needs, right? Every agreement can be done in one full round of consensus. You need less messages to exchange between participants to agree on something, right? So that means pretty much every round, you can produce a new block and have consensus on a new set of transactions, which is what makes the protocol efficient. But what you lose from that is that you don't get instant finality, right? In BFT, as soon as you've got a full run of votes from everyone, the block is settled and that's final. Whereas in Ouroboros, like in Bitcoin, you got a probabilistic proof and you have to wait. And as time passes, the true becomes more true or more immutable, but it's not immediately immutable. It's an eventual consensus only.
So the main trade-offs are like you can scale the level of participation in the network, but on the other hand, if you use something like a BFT-based network, you are for this deterministic finality, and you're basically compromising that part of the system.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily a problem, right? It's always the matter of use cases that you have. But BFT-based protocol usually don't scale above a few hundreds of participants.
Yeah.
Whereas some things like Ouroboros, we see it on Cardano with 3,000 participating block producing nodes, and it still works, right? Whereas the same thing on a BFT side protocol would just be not imaginable. It just would not work. There are way too many messages, and as you add new participants, the number of messages you add is not linear in the number of participants. So that means each new participant adds even more cost to running the protocol.
It's the quadratic messaging overhead. Yeah. So where are we at right now with Ouroboros protocol? There's this currently the Praos version on the Cardano side and the Samsika, like Ouroboros Samsika. I hope that I pronounced it correctly. Mina side. What are the different properties offered by these different protocols actually? I mean,
you mean the whole history or
like which stage? There's an end goal in mind with the Ouroboros protocol, and with the current iterations, where are we right now?
Yeah, I mean, basically every iteration tries to overcome one of the limitations that you initially had. Like as Mathias said, the original one still did not have exactly the same guarantees as the Bitcoin protocol had. So then prows basically, or in the original Ouroboros, you assumed that the networking functionality is perfect in the sense that you have a certain length for a time slot, and within that slot, every participant can get the latest block. And that is used in the proofs. And so if you have a real network where sometimes it takes a bit longer and not all parties get that information, then basically your proofs are no longer valid. So it's not, in practice, it's also not like a binary thing where if some messages are late, then you don't have any guarantees, but at least formally the proofs, they use that perfect network. And then in Prowse, you get some variability in the network and in the speed of messages and in the latency, and you allow for the adversary to control the network delays. And so in that way, you can model a network that sometimes just is a bit slower, and the slower the network, the more advantage the adversary has. And so your proofs are still valid, and with the decline of the networking functionality, it becomes easier to attack the network, but you still know how much easier it gets. And then with Genesis, you solve the problem of basically not being able to join the network if you've been offline for a long time, or if you're just joining for the first time, without having a trusted source about like what's the current best chain is.
It's a dynamic availability.
Exactly. Yeah, it's the dynamic availability, and you do that by basically having the same consensus mechanism, but having a slightly different chain selection rule. So in classical Ouroboros, you just have a global longest chain criterion where you say, okay, whichever chain is the longest is the one with the honest majority of stake. And in Genesis, you replace that by a local longest chain rule, where you say that if you have a fork that happened a long time ago, you don't only compare the total length, but you also compare how fast the different chains were growing close to that fork. And then in Samasika, basically what we do is we translate that rule to using a sliding window of chain density. And because what we want to do in Samasika is having succinct blockchains. So one where it's basically constant time, or at least where the time that it takes to verify a chain doesn't depend on the length of the chain, but only on the size of the state. And so you can't, that means in particular that you can't require to look at the whole chain history. And so we summarize like how quickly the chain grew at any given point in time by having that sliding window and then having the minimal chain density over any of those windows. Matthias,
And
which variants did I forget?
there is Leos, arguably, that's being kind of under discussion on our end now. It's being pushed a lot on the Cardano side as a way to increase on the throughput. And it's like, as Philipp said, we always have a set of hypotheses and a set of results. And there are two things you can try to improve now. There is the results themselves, make the protocol more efficient, make the protocol more scalable or whatever. And you can also improve on the hypothesis. And the hypothesis here usually falls into the security model, because it's something to keep in mind that, every time we say a protocol is secure, it is secure according to some adversarial model that you consider. So you give the adversaries in the system some powers, and you're going to say, okay, given that they are able to do that, then the protocol is secure. And the assumptions in the previous version of Ouroboros were a bit weak in some part, you could say, because you would assume that the adversary could not, for example, corrupt another participant instantly, but there were some delays in between that. And then you think, okay, in real life, actually, is that valid assumptions to make? And if it's not, then how can you improve your security model so that your protocol remains, keeps the same properties, has the same results, but have even stronger hypothesis that makes it even more secure? And I think now we're kind of observing things going on both sides. It's how you make it more secure and how you make it more efficient at what it does already, without jeopardizing everything else.
And a large part of Laos is moving from sequential blocks, right, to something that's more in parallel, right? Many different blocks.
I don't like that word, parallel.
Fair enough.
And I think anyone doing software would have always a bit of PTSD hearing that word, because there is still some kind of checkpointing in layers, right? You still have this notion of consensus blocks. But yes, the idea is that now you have all sort of idle time between those blocks, which is in principle there to allow participants to synchronize. And that's crucial in the case where there is an adversary actively attacking the network. But in the nominal mode where everyone is kind of happily collaborating, that idle time is something you could use for something else. And what Laios is kind of saying is that in the optimistic scenario where things go well and people behave as expected, then you can make use of that idle time to do something that, and use the network resources during that time to speed up the rest of the protocol.
That's a concept of pipelining.
Yeah. So you could say it's a form of parallelization, or like doing stuff instead of doing nothing.
Yeah.
And it degrades gracefully into kind of Ouroboros prowess in the case where the protocol is under attack, because you still have to check pointing blocks and so on, which is actually core to the design of Ouroboros itself in the end.
So we talked about this probabilistic and deterministic finality, right? This is a quality that you compromise for the amount of participation you can acquire by using Ouroboros. But we have seen some protocols using like finality gadgets to bring the deterministic finality to a protocol like Ouroboros. So is it really possible to give Ouroboros some of those deterministic finality features using different other technologies, or are we like compromising something else by bringing such features in?
Is it possible? I tend always to say yes, because
it's a possibility, right?
it's just software in the end. Right? Everything's possible so long as you put the effort into it. But the sort of longer answer would be, in the same way that Laios is trying to make use of those kind of idle time, you could also make use of this idle time not to improve the throughput, but to improve the finality of the network. And one, I think, thing that most protocols that try to achieve that are doing is to run some kind of BFT-style voting sessions on top of these snapshotting times. I think Tezos is doing something like that, where after every block has been produced, now you give an opportunity to everyone to vote on those blocks and sort of reduce the time it takes for reaching a high enough finality probability. And it's all a trade-off, right? Because your networking resources are limited. So let's say you have, 1 gigabytes of data per second you can transfer. Now, do you want to transfer more, blocks in that time and increase the throughput? Or do you want to use that to, transfer votes and, improve finality? And maybe the ideal protocol is something that does a bit of both. And maybe, have sometimes where it does one, sometimes where it does the two and switch between two modes. Who knows? It really depends, again, on the use case and what someone needs for the protocol. But I guess within the resources available that you have, you can try to go on each of those dimensions. And at the end, the limiting factor will always be the physical resources. And it's just where you draw kind of the different cursors on your protocol.
If you look at Ethereum Layer 1, they're also trying to bring this decentralization part using an entirely different protocol. So if you just compare and contrast to these two systems, like Cardano having like around 3,000 validator nodes and Mina having like around 400 to 500 validator nodes using Ouroboros, and Ethereum Layer 1 using having around 10,000 validator machines working in that system. So what different qualities do you see in this, the base layer of Ethereum and Ouroboros-based systems?
It's always, as Mathias said, it's always a matter of trade-offs. It's also a matter of how long has a system been around, and then also the question of what do you want to do with all these validators. I mean, in the end, the reason that you have many validators is because you don't want to put too much trust in any single entity. And then the question is how many validators do you need for that to be satisfied? Because after you pass that threshold, it's not as if the system would get more capacity by having more validators. It's just they're replicating the same work. And so it's in the end, it's a matter of taste and priorities about like the size of a system and how many validators do you want for that?
Every system, you say, I have an ideal number of validators, right? I think Cardano, like the system almost gravitates right towards a number of validators. Does Mina have like a target level? 3,000? I feel like it's natural, but with Mina, curious.
No. So the reason why in Cardano you gravitate towards that certain number is because of the way that the incentive system is shaped.
Yeah.
So
K parameter.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So we like the incentives are designed so that a pool that grows beyond a certain size doesn't aggregate more rewards, and so there is like this basically set parameter at which it's optimal for everybody to have a certain number of validators, because then the rewards for everyone are the largest. We don't have that in Mina, so it's like just an open thing, and if you want to start a new validator node, you can do it, and like there's no preferred size. It's like grow.
No systematic pressure pushing things in one direction or the other.
I think you're touching the interesting bits also. It's like, I like to see the consensus in a sense as a black box. And once you say that Ouroboros achieves the same properties as Nakamoto style consensus, you can pretty much see the consensus as one black box that does one thing. And on top of that, you have all the other things that kind of tell the different systems apart. The ledger rules, the incentives, and how they decide to organize the systems. And those are not specified in the consensus. Like Ouroboros doesn't really tell you how you should do delegation on your system, how you should rewards people, how you should specify a particular transaction format, how the smart contract system should work, and so on. So on those things, you have so much freedom and so on top of the consensus. And what Ouroboros tries to put forward is something they call universal composability, which is in a way to say, well, we've developed the consensus in a certain framework, and so long as you agree with the hypothesis from that framework and you go with that, then you can do stuff on top of it, and you can compose that with other protocols, and you don't break the security of the protocol. And so it gives a lot of freedoms on what you can do on top of it. And the consensus, so far, I think they are mostly all doing the same thing, right? It's just that Ouroboros come with a nice proof of that thing being secure and an argument of why it is. For the proof of work based blockchain like Nakamoto style consensus, the proof is relatively easy to grasp, and it's what makes the system very elegant in a sense. But once you've got that, okay, the consensus, we haven't really invented anything since Bitcoin, I would say. It's just a different ways of doing the same thing. And I'm exaggerating a bit. I don't want to undermine the work of researchers, obviously. There has been a lot of works invented and done on top. But, on the fundamental ideas, it's still based on that very same Nakamoto-style approach. And therefore, the differentiators are usually on the rest, on how do you do the ledgers, how do you shape the incentives, how do you shape the networks, and everything else.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, the interesting stuff is like what's the programming model, and how do you build on these systems, and that is something where the existing systems diverge quite a lot, and where there's also a lot of innovation and new things. So on Cardano with Plutus, and on Mina with O1JS, where you can basically construct provable programs without really having to know what a circuit is, and these kind of things. One interesting thing about Ouroboros in particular, I mean, basically, oversimplifying a bit, it's Nakamoto-style consensus, but without having to burn the world for doing hashes. And that made it very interesting for Mina, where we want to have a succinct proof of validity, and also like an incrementally creating proof of validity and doing chain selection. And basically these properties that you can just make a binary comparison between two chains, and you don't need to prove anything negative about the history, that made it quite amenable for putting Samasika on top of Ouroboros, and then creating a snark for the whole system, basically, which is what allows this succinctness.
I think, as Mathias said, universally composable. You look at lots of different things. You can really use it in a different way, right? Obviously, Mina has an account-based model. Cardano with the UTXO-based model. It really can support many different things. So I've always thought it's very elegant in that sense and robust. So.
And having worked with both UTXO and account based, you kind of know why both exists, because they both have their difficulties that annoy you, and you have times where you wish you were living in the other world.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Philip, you touched upon this point that and Mathias, you said like Bitcoin basically invented this concept of like this consensus protocol where the computational energy spent to to build the chain, and it's pretty clear that which chain is the legitimate one, because the chain on which the maximum amount of computational energy is spent. When you take that concept and put it all into this proof of stake, then it becomes an imaginary value concept. And so that people talk about, oh, nothing at stake problem. How do you deal with that? Is slashing a way to deal with that? And the Ouroboros space, it does not, slashing does not have any mathematical validation as a concept, but I think it's an opinion thing. And is it really possible for a proof of stake protocol to give those qualities that Bitcoin's Nakamoto consensus protocol gives, where it's at two different resources, right? And so it becomes more and more abstract when it becomes proof of stake. What's your take on that?
Is it a trick question?
It's a trick.
Because this is exactly what Ouroboros kind of claims, right? That yes, it is possible to achieve that with proof of stake. Here is the proof, right?
Like with the Ouroboros Genesis, what it provides is the dynamic availability system like Coin provides. So we have not tested that on the proof of stake side in the wild.
You mean that Genesis is not yet battle tested?
So that property, I was just it's proven on paper. I think it's two different things to test something in the wild.
The two things are complementary, right? I mean, a proof tells you that given the assumptions, it will always be the case that you have the properties that you're looking for. And battle testing something tells you that so far nobody has been able to crack it, right? And so they both give you some information. They're qualitatively different, I would say, because the proof gives you, within the model, it gives you like absolute certainty. And the battle testing basically replaces your assumptions by history and saying that, like, in the world that we have lived up to this point, it hasn't been cracked. And so I would say, like, okay, if Genesis gives you a proof that you have dynamic availability and the assumptions are reasonable, then, and this is a matter of personal preference to a degree, but for me, coming from a scientific background, that is a lot. And just observing that something has been running for a while and hasn't been cracked is like, it's also good to see that. But I wouldn't be disheartened by Genesis just being comparatively new and having been deployed since like 2 or 3 years ago.
What security assumptions are required for Genesis? Right, there are certain things that assumptions we're making on the network, what people will be able to do, that makes Genesis actually provably secure. Right, once you get outside those confines, those assumptions and security assumptions don't hold up. So what are those?
I would just have only two things, I guess. One is still this 50% stake that is owned by the honest majority. Yep. And you're also assuming that, the honest majority follows the protocol, which sometimes is not given various implementations and so on. It can be subtle difference that then deviate from the actual assumptions and therefore could invalidate the proofs and so on. And the second one is still that you need kind of that the sort of adversary can delay messages, can control, reorder messages on the network and so on, but they can only do so up until a certain amount of time. They cannot indefinitely delay messages on the network. And that's still one of the strong assumptions we have on that protocol, which you might see that is maybe not valid, because you could say maybe an adversary can actually incapacitate you for long enough that this assumption no longer holds. And how long is long enough? That's also a good question, because as Ouroboros states, it's unknown from the participant that there is a boundary. No one knows what exactly is the boundary. We just know there is a boundary, and that's kind of enough to build the proofs on top of that.
And I think the point that you raised about like the energies that has been put into it and the stake, I think that is probably more related to the incentive side of things, because both Bitcoin and Ouroboros, they tell you that if you have an honest majority, then stuff works, right? Then you have liveness and persistence. And if you don't have an honest majority, then it doesn't work.
I think that the view on the paper, in a sense, and the proof, is also like very Manichaean, right? It's like there are the bad guys and the good guys, and either you're an adversary and you do adversarial stuff, and you have a black flag with a skull on it, and so on.
Yeah.
But in the real life, it's much more subtle, right? The adversaries, they are not identifying themselves necessarily as adversaries, and they just have sometimes diverging, opinion. And you could argue that some, stake pool operators on Cardano might be adversarial in the way, they do things, because, maybe they have, these or these incentives for running their stake pools, and therefore they adopt behavior that goes slightly in the adversarial side. And is that an adversary, or is it just, the way social construct works? And so we have to keep in mind that the paper, while it, builds a proof, it builds the proofs on a model. And the model is just a kind of projection of the reality. And the real world is actually different from that model always. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a model. And that is something to keep in mind. Like, the world is not as simply divided between the honest participants and the adversaries. Everyone is kind of a bit of both to some degrees, and it's just on then how much of that actually impacts the proofs and the execution of the protocol. That's I guess the tricky bits of solely relying on the proofs, and where having a battle-tested system, in a sense, give you that sense that, okay, our assumptions and the model is maybe not that bad. And that's something I think every protocol should do at some point or another, is compare at some point some of the results you can measure and observe from the real system, and put that back against the model and see, okay, was the model actually good? And how far off was it actually?
And then iterate the model if you see that,
yes.
And look at the whole thing, not only the consensus, but also look at the incentive structure. Look at why are people deviating from the consensus protocol as it is written, and do we need to adjust our model? Does that mean that we also need to adjust our consensus in order to be safe in that advanced model? And what about the incentive structure?
Oh, good question. Obviously, we know Leos is coming next for Cardano. Are you, and I've seen Mina's work a lot on their, building ZK dApps and things like that. But are there any consensus updates that are coming to Mina in the future or planned, or do you feel like with your current consensus model, you're in a good place to move forward?
So we're always thinking, of course, about evolving the consensus and looking at how can we improve the time to finality. Can we maybe get instant finality in a way, deterministic finality? At the moment, we're focusing pretty hard on making it easy for people to build ZK apps on top of Mina. So with the upcoming major upgrade that will enable people to just use O1.js to program on Mina. That is where most of the engineering efforts are focused on right now. And the rest is like, okay, we're thinking about it, but we're not yet executing on it just because of the finiteness of resources.
You mentioned finality, right? Especially with interoperability. Longest chain is a little bit more difficult, right? Nakamoto consensus runs into a little bit more difficulty. When it has to keep consensus with other chains that might have some level of finality. Maybe I'll pose this as a larger question. What challenges does Ouroboros have towards cross-chain consensus, and how are I'll leave it there.
It's something that basically you always need to consider in whatever you want to do. Like with simple payments, it's just you need to wait long enough to make sure that you actually have received the payment before you send out the goods, right? And that's something that everybody can just make a judgment call on, whether they're selling ice cream or houses. And but if you want to implement systems that build on top of a system that has probabilistic finality, you need to write your system and your whole system in a way that it can deal with these rollbacks that will happen. So it makes the development of things a bit more challenging, I would say. And then if you need to coordinate between different systems, so and that can be either cross-chain functionality, where you could have rollbacks on both sides. So it's you need to think through things a lot, and so that is also a thing where like good testing and having good models of stuff is pretty advantageous, because it's just easy to miss some cases there.
And I think that there is always need for a bit of both, in a sense. You know, a colleague of mine always says that you don't buy your bread with the central bank, you know. And the way I see systems like Ouroboros or Nakamoto-style consensus is being this central bank. They are ultimately settlement systems. And therefore, you know, all those small payment transactions that currently happens on those layers, because that's also, you know, part of the adoption process, but ultimately should be moved to other layers that can give you instant finality and will eventually settle things on a, you know, strong settlement layers like Cardano or Mina or, you know, Nakamoto-style consensus. And on that, and I'm going to say something maybe shocking again. I know I tend to have a very hyperbolic style of speaking sometimes, but you know, most of those systems do not scale in the sense of scaling as in engineering. And by that I mean, as you add more users, you cannot make the system produce, you know, more of what it does. You know, most of the time you have a finite amount of throughput available, and therefore your system, you know, does not scale. We always say, you know, talk about blockchain scaling. It's not scaling, it's just performance improvements. You know, you're just making it more efficient. But a scalable system, in principle, should accommodate to an increasing demand. And most of those systems do not scale, and that's just a reality. So a way to scale the system is by spanning more subsystems and sort of redirecting the traffic to those subsystems. And so, yeah, you cannot work around the need for having layer 2s and for having systems that have different trade-offs. And that's interoperable, that are interoperable with one another.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. And it's also a bit unfortunate that scaling is such an overloaded term. Like we talked about scaling earlier, and meaning the ability to add more validator nodes to a system. So by just scaling the size of the system, but that in blockchains, that doesn't mean that the capabilities of the system actually increase. They decrease typically, because you just have more nodes doing the same thing, replicating the same work, but you have more communication overhead. And yeah, so in order to get true scaling, as Mathias said, you need to have layer 2 solutions that basically interact with the base layer at some frequency, but as little as possible, and as little as necessary, as much as necessary and as little as possible. So as much as necessary in order to get like frequent settlement, but yeah, not for everything.
And that's also the thing, right? If you're just buying your coffee on your bread, do you need 3,000 other validators to, you know, vouch for that instantly? Probably not. You will be fine if, you know, a small consortium of 100 people running a BFT protocol would do that. They would do it quite efficiently. Then they would aggregate some of that results back onto the, you know, layer 1. And that aggregate is sort of big enough that now you want to have more eyes on that and make sure that the consensus used for that particular agreement is you know, well done. And it's also happens to be exactly the way, you know, the card system works today with Visa and MasterCard. They don't settle transactions instantly. They accumulate them usually for the whole day, and they settle at a precise hour every day. And that settlement, it's only after that settlement has happened that your card payment is actually recorded on the system. And before that, it's just kind of an optimistic scenario, an optimistic payments where, you know, most of the time it goes through and it's fine. And I think most of us have been using card payments for a while to know that it's kind of okay. But in principle, you could always have case of chargebacks where, well, actually, your payments was rejected for this or that reasons, and you try to double spend something, and there is also this holding settlement kind of thing, and it's been working like that for many years. It's just that right now there is a single party that decides on what transaction gets in, and that's more of an ideological concerns now. And the promise of blockchain is maybe we can move to a system that does roughly the same thing, but with more eyes on it and with more accountability across different entities.
Yeah, exactly. And the solution cannot be to use the base layer for everything. You need to have solutions that build on top of that. And for that, we have some nice models. On Mina, it's quite easy to write ZK rollups. On Cardano, you have the Hydra protocol. And then you can have like smaller entities that can process transactions at a faster rate and then only post the result back to the chain.
The thesis of the settlement layer, that we cannot process everything in one layer, we need to do different layers. More and more people think this is the case. There's a assumption, this assumption is pretty prevalent in the industry. But one thing that I think the blockchain, especially with proof of stake blockchain space, is split on is how to solve the nothing at stake problem. A large part of the ecosystem adopt the slashing concept, and if you look at Cardano or Mina, there's some slashing. So what's your take on slashing, actually?
Yeah, I mean, negative incentives in general, I would even make the question a bit larger, but that's something people have a problem with, right? If you do something bad, you get punished. My take is, honestly, I don't have any opinion on that. I've been sort of proposing sometimes some negative incentives. Actually, about SIP 1694 on Cardano, we had also this question of how do you get people to participate into governance, and we discussed the idea of negative incentives multiple times, and there is definitely and usually kind of a big back off on that, and people don't like it. So I tend to be kind of on the side of, well, if we can avoid it, then that's better. If you can find positive incentives or like a reinforcement incentives, I think it's always better than a punishment. And some people I also believes that you cannot have a proof of stake delegation based system without slashing, because people will misbehave, and if you don't have the stick, it's not gonna work. I don't know about that. I mean, Cardano's been working pretty good on that for quite a while now, so I would assume that there is always a way to find some positive reinforcement kind of learning rather than punishing. But yeah, I don't have a strong opinion.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of negative incentives myself. I think generally incentives are really, really hard to get right, and the more complicated your incentive system is, the more edge cases you will build into the system that you didn't really think of. And so the easier your incentive system can be, the better. And I think the incentives of you perform according to the protocol and then you get some rewards is something that's quite nice. And then you can iterate on that and say, okay, what about like the selfish mining, and how do you distribute rewards and all these kind of things. But I haven't seen a compelling argument for why slashing should be necessary in order to have people behave according to the protocol when they just get paid for doing so. Another interesting thing with Ouroboros in particular is that there are different ways in which you can misbehave. So there is what is called open adversarial behavior. So if you are eligible to produce a block for a certain slot, then you could send multiple blocks for the same slot around to different people. And that is something that if you have enough knowledge, you can find out, and you can see that this is misbehaving. And this is something that you can use for some attacks, but it's open adversarial behavior. And then there is things like just not forwarding blocks, or just not creating a block when you were supposed to do so, which are things that are not detectable, and which are also things that could just happen without any fault of your own, like if your network cable gets cut or your computer crashes or whatever. And so I wouldn't want to punish people for something that just like happened if it's not creating actual imminent damage to other parties, then I don't see a reason why you should be slashed for like not creating a block or not having it seen by enough people in time. And for the open adversarial behavior, I think the better approach than to just punish people in a financial way would be to say, okay, let's just record evidence of that misbehavior, and then other nodes can just ignore whatever that obviously like adversarial party is doing, which is safer for the protocol overall. And it's also, I mean, apart from the technical thing that you need to create a proof and post it to the chain in order for everybody to ignore it, I think it's also, you don't have to solve these questions about if you need to punish somebody by slashing stake, but the stake is something that is actually delegated to them. Do you slash it from the people delegating to them? Do they have to have a certain amount of stake from themselves that you then can slash? Or what do you do in that situation? So I think for open adversarial behavior, it's preferable to build in actual countermeasures into the protocol. And for adversarial behavior, that's not actually, that isn't necessarily your fault. I would be hesitant to actively punish.
Yeah, in a way, I see incentives not necessarily as kind of a technical argument sometimes, but more as a way to build communities. Because the incentives are like the rules of the game, and you're going to play that game if you agree with the rule. And therefore, you're going to attract a certain group of people, certain community that has certain education background and so on. That might be more more tempted to collaborate, sort of to work together on that particular system. And the incentives really just fixes that in a sense. I also believe that after a certain time, the incentive doesn't really matter. When the system has been bootstrapped, everything is in place and has been like organically evolving, what the incentives are don't really play a role in shaping the system because it's just there. And now moving the system has so much inertia that even a change in the incentive might not have actually the effect you expect. So it's mainly about how do you build this initial group of people in community. And therefore, you might be okay with the fact that if you do something wrong, you get slapped in the face. And if that's the kind of game you want to play, then you go for that. If you would rather get, a gentle pat on the back for doing a good thing, then, you go on that side.
Good point. Yeah.
It's really game theory incentives, and game theory slashing is, positive, negative incentives that. So someone once said most, or I heard, I can't remember who told me this, but essentially game theory research is like typically done between maybe 10 to 20 people. And that's most of game theory that's out there in the research. And blockchains are probably some of the largest studies of game theory in large systems. And the jury's still out because ultimately you're just dealing with people, right? I've always thought that was fascinating. That it's not there's the aspect of the machine breaking, creating nodes. Then you have the human aspect and what goes on there, and that's very difficult to model.
Always, and regardless of what your rules are, there will be people to game the system. The rules are just exposing, what are the possible strategies you give. But then, you can't prevent people to serve their own interest or based on those particular rules. And I don't think there is a perfect incentives ever. So it's just, are you also okay with the drawback? And you could see that also for example, like, in voting systems, should you reward people or not? Because if you reward people, you might get more participations, but you might also get less interested people that take part in the voting, therefore, right? So are you okay with that effect? Are you okay with that outcome? If you're okay with that, then the incentives you put is pretty good for you. If you're not, because you just really want to get people that are interested, then maybe you need to change incentives. And it's really just that, what are the rules of your system, and are you okay with the way people are going to play that game based on those rules?
And also, what are the effects of people gaming the system? Like, in which direction would gaming the system drive them, and would that direction be catastrophic for the system overall?
Also,
yeah. And that could be catastrophic because it actually breaks the system directly, or just because it drives other people who don't want to game the system away. So it's interesting.
essentially saying, right, keep your incentives simple. I assume, the idea there is if your incentives are simpler, you're going to be able to at least understand how people might game the system, right? If the complexity will give many vectors, and it's hard to always game out all those thoughts.
Yeah, and maybe I would like to partly retract that system. Don't make it overly complicated, because if it's too simple, then it's also like then it's obvious how you can game it, and then there is also like, and if you don't allow for any complexity in the rules, then you cannot or some complexity in the rules allows you to counteract some ways of gaming the system. But the question is, how far do you need to push that before you are left with something that works? And do you want to? And I think the point that Mathias raised is really good. Is that having negative incentives kind of it attracts a different kind of people with different mindsets than not having them. And I kind of like to be in the camp where you don't have negative reinforcement.
So Philip, you earlier mentioned about when we were talking about the size of the validator number that Mina is aiming at, and you don't you don't have any specific number. Is it because the core concept of Mina is that the concept that this succinct proof can basically be there in like the small devices like smartphones and everything, so you want to maximize that part of the system? Is that one of the reasons why?
No, it's not. So I mean, ultimately the reason why you have that drive to a specific number in Cardano is because the incentives are structured in a way that if you have too much stake, then it's actually bad. That concentration is bad for your rewards. And in Mina, the reward system is simpler. It's just like you get rewards for the blocks and the transactions. That, however, has a little bit to do with that succinctness, because the reward system in Cardano is not that simple, and you have these pools, and you have rewards per pool, and then it's distributed among all the delegators, and I actually quite like that system. But it would be a bit more difficult to implement on Mina because of the requirement that the whole protocol needs to be provable, and you need to have a snark for the whole chain. And if you have automatic reward distribution, that needs to be included in that proof. And the more involved that reward distribution is, the more complex it gets to create that proof. And so in Mina, we don't have automatic distribution of rewards yet. There are at the moment there are efforts of coming up with a way that you can have automatic reward distribution, but it's not settled on what does that actually look like. Does it work via smart contracts? Does it work in the protocol itself, or how do you do it? But
yeah, and that's something a lot of people don't realize on Cardano. What Philipp just hinted at, that it's one of the most difficult questions to answer on the Cardano protocol, is how much reward should I get on the next epoch? That requires actually running the protocol from the genesis and being able to tell exactly every single stake movement that has happened between the actors. Because at every epoch, the rewards, there is no on-chain manifestations of those rewards being distributed. Right? It's just a calculation that the node does, but there is nothing that is posted on-chain, right? Because that would be a complete chaos if at every epoch boundary you would distribute all the rewards through transaction, right? There would be millions of transactions to all the rewards accounts, and the chain would just be bloated for the entire epoch, basically.
And that is one of the... sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, that is one of the things where it's really uncomfortable to be in UTXO ledger, because if you were to distribute the rewards via transactions at every epoch boundary, and you have a UTXO system, you would create one UTXO per UTXO at every epoch boundary. So you would have an exponential explosion of the UTXO. And so that's the reason that Cardano does not keep the rewards on-chain. And it doesn't have to, because the calculation that determines the rewards is deterministic. And so every node can just do it, and then they would agree, even if they don't exchange information about it.
Yeah, and I would even add that this is exactly why Cardano uses an account-based system for that. And a lot of people don't realize that, but Cardano is actually a hybrid system, UTXO and account. And the account is specifically used for rewards.
Yeah.
Because that's a hard question. And you were talking about limitations of kind of Ouroboros. I'm not sure if this is to be put on top of Ouroboros, but in a way, since the consensus doesn't specify how you should do delegation, how you should build this stake distributions and movements, it's kind of a big question mark still. And therefore every protocol is trying different ways, and they have different trade-offs. Of course, everyone is happy to get their rewards on the Cardano side, but this creates a quite significant technical challenge that also now is seen in the implementation of a node. If you wanted to build a new node, well, one of the big challenges you have is that reward system, and how do you keep track of the stake across the system and so on? Because now if you're not right, by the Lovelace, then you can create a subtle difference that might impact the leader schedules, and that might impact completely then the execution of the whole consensus. So tracking those rewards precisely is utterly important.
And there are very subtle points there that you can get wrong very easily. So, for example, if there is something like an exponentiation or just like in there, and you might be tempted to just use floating points and a standard library for that. But if you do that, then you might be in deep trouble, because of the way that floating point numbers work. Sometimes different compiler options, different architectures might come to slightly different results, and in most cases they will, like, the rounding will be good enough so that you are right by the Lovelace. But if you're not, and if there are say there are two node implementations and or just two different architectures on which the nodes are being run, then that might create a fork of the whole system if they don't agree on the rewards, because somebody used a floating point library somewhere instead of using fractions.
Yeah, so now I forgot actually what was Suraj's original question.
Yeah, actually. Someone told me that Ouroboros protocol has the viability to be part of every settlement layer that is going to be out there in a over a long time frame. Meaning that this is one of the robust systems that has been developed that came out of the Cardano research, basically. So would you say that this Ouroboros protocol is the most significant outcome from the research based on Cardano protocol?
That's two different questions. The most...
Yeah, there are two different questions. Like, you can go take one or the two.
Is it the most significant research that came out of the Cardano research? Probably yes, I would say. There has been other significant stuff, but they more or less all relate to Ouroboros to some extent. So I would say that's definitely like the backbone of many other stuff. Will we have only Ouroboros-based consensus moving forward? Probably no, just because there will always be competitions and someone will always want to do something different, and I don't think there is any bad in that. So long as the systems are eventually interoperable. In the same way that today you don't have a single card payment scheme that has one. You could argue that it's mainly now MasterCard versus Visa, but there are also I think 20 different other card schemes actually competing with one another. So yeah, that kind of things should not matter eventually. That you use one or the other, because we should find a way to build bridges and make things interoperable.
Yeah, pretty much agree. I mean, on the question of having just one, competition will always be there, and also you will never just have everybody accept one solution, even if it's objectively better than others. And I think Bitcoin is also like, you cannot switch Bitcoin over to something that's proof of stake just because there is so much financial interest in the miners. So I think this is probably controversial, but I think the only reason that Bitcoin is still running is because there are so many people invested so heavily in the mining, and I don't see any technical reason why anybody should run a proof of work system anywhere. It's just it doesn't.
Yeah, but I think that's also a feature of Bitcoin in a sense.
It's a feature, but it's also an anti-feature because it makes it very, very stable, but also impossible to bring innovation to it in a fundamental sense. Because
I guess like if today you were like, I mean, if we're like back in 2009 and you would have both Bitcoin and Ouroboros Genesis available to you, a rational mind would probably just pick Ouroboros Genesis.
Yeah.
But the truth is that Ouroboros Genesis came 10 years after Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So now that's a whole different stories because there have been people invested in Bitcoin that have been an ecosystem building around it. And you see that just, if you take also like, I don't know, any JavaScript framework as a developer that comes out there, every 6 months there is a new JS framework that comes to solve all the different problems that this previous framework has. And you still have people that are there, no, I'm still using jQuery. It's like 15 years old, but there is a whole ecosystem on top of it, and I'm fine with that. And that's just the reality. The inertia that the system builds, and we know with community and ecosystem, is really hard to remove, even if you might bring a new, better solutions on all the different metrics that you can imagine. There is still the metric, which is the usage. This one you cannot invent. Right? This one needs to go through time, and therefore some system might remains there just because of this inertia that they have.
Exactly. I mean, Bitcoin basically was the first solution to how can you maintain consensus in a permissionless setting. And now it's a proof of concept that just keeps on running because people are invested in it, and it's really basically impossible to make the switch. As to your other question about the most significant research output from Cardano, I think definitely Ouroboros is probably that, but I would also mention Plutus on the programming languages side, which is really elegant and nice. So wouldn't want to brush that under the carpet.
Yeah, it's hard to put a choice in a sense.
Kind
of. There are stuff like Mithril, for example, that I find completely marvelous as well. I'm like, this idea of being able to prove stuff based on, a multi-sig that you can weight by stake. It's like, mind blowing to me. So there are stuff like that definitely, are useful and sort of amazing, but I don't want to say that they have no value outside of, the existing system. But if you just take Mithril aside, alone, okay, what do you do with that? Well, not much if you don't have the rest of the system. So you could argue that if you had to rank them, that would come after Ouroboros, possibly, right? And Plutus, I would even say that, kind of the same thing. It's super cool to have a smart contract language, but if you don't have an execution layer to use that smart contract language, and
And Ouroboros is also universally composable, right? As a protocol.
Probably. I'm not 100% sure here. I would assume, given it was kind of, it came from the same people, I would imagine they kind of...
by other POS protocols. At least that was the basis of it. I actually had an interesting question that we touched on lightly earlier, so I'm going to go backwards. But you talked about scaling, right? And obviously there's lots... That term is overloaded, and so we talk about making systems more efficient. But when you get down to kind of that lowest level, you talk about scaling with Ouroboros and reducing the amount of communication between all nodes from a consensus perspective. Is Ouroboros in a very strong position to scale compared to BFT style chain? Or consensus model.
It's hard to have less communication than in Ouroboros, to be frank. Except if you start maybe considering stuff like sharding, where then you're gonna have smaller pools of nodes that are gonna agree and therefore reduce the amount of communications. But
so in the sense of scaling, of being able to make the system larger and have more validating nodes, Ouroboros is in a very good sense of in a very good place. Right. In the sense of making the system more performant by increasing its size, then like if you want to scale in that sense, then don't use a blockchain, or use it less and use it only for the use it only for settling and like don't expect the blockchain to be the component that allows you to scale and build on top of it. And
that's something that was, I think, very, very visible on the early days of blockchain. Like in all the marketings and so on, you would hear that blockchain would make your system more efficient. No, it will not. It will not. Like if you take something that works and you make it more decentralized, you are adding complexity to the system. You are adding more, intermediaries, round trips of communication. You are not making your system more efficient. What you're gaining maybe is the trustlessness aspect, the permissionless aspect, and so on. But you are not making it more efficient. So that was, I think that kind of marketing line dropped a few years ago now. But I still remember when I was, my first days on blockchain, like, if you use Web3, you can make system more efficient and more easily. No, just
yeah. That was painful.
Yeah, and that is not the goal that we're trying to solve here.
Yes, it's like you're making with blockchain, you're making very extreme. You're choosing a very extreme point in the parameter space for designing your system, where you want to have a permissionless system that is decentralized, where anybody can take part and where nobody has the complete control of the system, by distributing the control to a diverse set of actors. And that is not something that is going to be efficient. But if you need that, then it's a valid trade-off to make. And then you need to think about, how can I have something that gives me that, and then somehow use it in a way and build something on top of that that can support the numbers of users that I want to have, and that can scale and that can be efficient. And the way that you typically do that is to use that extreme, like that extremely slow but secure and decentralized system, permissionless system, control-less system, in a very sparing way.
Yeah, and to bring a bit more nuance to what I said also earlier, there are some systems that you can make more efficient by distributing them, and what you're effectively doing is distributing the load on different shards, to use that word. But that requires usually synchronization between those things, and it's really hard to do in a trustless and permissionless manner. So yes, you have, for example, very efficient distributed database nowadays that can do that work, but there is usually a kind of single point of supervision control that spread things around, and there is a strong assumption on trust and who runs those machines.
Yeah, you're distributing the load, but you're not distributing the control. And on blockchains, you want to distribute the control, and that means you cannot distribute the load, because in order for the system to work, everybody cannot trust anybody else, because you don't have a hierarchy of, okay, this is where I get my truth from. In a way, the zero knowledge aspect in Mina helps with that, because in a normal blockchain, like, everybody has to validate every transaction, everybody has to evaluate every smart contract and stuff, and that only by that you get that trustlessness. With the zero knowledge proofs, you can have the block producer validate the transactions. You can have the execution of smart contracts be done off-chain by the user, which is very efficient, because like you have a very powerful computer in your phone, which is much more powerful than any blockchain could ever be. And then you submit a proof that you've done things correctly, and then only that proof has to be validated by everyone. And that can be done in an efficient manner, and in a manner that doesn't, whether the computational complexity doesn't increase or only increases sublinearly with the amount of things that you're proving. So in a way that helps with that anti-scaling behavior of blockchain systems.
Yeah, and I think I put a lot of hope in like recursive zero knowledge proofs.
Yeah.
Because that to me is one avenue that would actually give you scaling.
Yeah.
Because now you have a way of composing those proofs and making proofs of proofs and stuff like that, which means it doesn't really matter, because you can accommodate the increase in demand and still remains constant in the verification times of your validation. So that has a lot of power. But I think it's still an open resource question at this point.
It is possible. So in Mina, we actually use it for creating the validity proof of the latest block. So when you create a block and add it to the chain, you create a snark that tells you that it's a valid extension of the latest block. And then you can basically include, you can basically include that snark that the chain has been valid up to the last block and combine it with your snark that your block is a valid extension. And then you can have a recursive proof that your block is a valid extension of the Genesis block, including that minimum minimum window chain density, minimum chain density across any window of a particular size. And in that way, you can create that proof efficiently because you're reusing the proof that you already had, and validating that proof then gives you a validation not only of the latest block but of the whole chain history. So, and then in that snark you also have the snarks for all these smart contract transactions and stuff. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Quickly, does Ouroboros provide benefits for Mina in doing ZK, right? You talked about things are universally composable. It's a relatively flexible consensus, but is there an actual benefit for using Ouroboros and what you're looking to do with Mina and the ZK aspects, right?
The Ouroboros Genesis chain selection rule, basically adapted in Ouroboros Samasika, allows you to have like a compact like a summary of the chain where you say, okay, I have this proof that it's valid, and I have a proof that the minimum window density is that number. And then in order to pick any chain from a given set of candidates, you only have to compare that one thing. And so that's kind of so Ouroboros was a good target for creating a succinct blockchain. There also looks at original Nakamoto consensus, which has very similar properties, but you have to burn the world in order to do it. So that having Ouroboros was very good, because it gives you the same guarantees, it gives you the same properties that allow you to do that one-to-one comparison and pick the chain, which is very good for the succinct blockchain, and you don't have to waste that much energy on it.
That's a banger statement to conclude the discussion. And it's been a fantastic conversation. And thank you so much, Philipp and Mathias, for participating and taking your valuable time and talking about this. I'll again say that it's one of the biggest outcomes of the Cardano research. And thank you, Perry, for participating. Thanks so much.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Yeah. That was good. That was good to see Philipp. I had a long time not chatting. We used to work a bit closely when we were on Hydra back then. So that's nice to see us in two different contexts, still quite motivated by this whole thing.
Thanks for tuning in. If you are keen on getting deeper insights about Web3 tech, our newsletter, Just the Metrics, is just what you need. It's packed with valuable information and it's completely free. You can subscribe by clicking the link in the video description. It's a great way to keep up with the latest in the Web3 space straight to your inbox. And before you go, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more updates and insights. The support is what keeps these videos coming. So see you in the next video.